So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Brown University. I'm originally Canadian. I grew up in a remote Indigenous community in northern Saskatchewan, and then we moved to a remote mining town in northern British Columbia. And so the first time I lived in a city was in Vancouver, where I completed my Bachelor's of Science. And then I went to the University of Toronto for my PhD. I did my postdoctoral training at the University of California, San Francisco, and I've been at Brown University where I run a lab that studies the neural and molecular mechanisms of addiction since 2013. I'm currently on sabbatical in Vancouver, Canada, but I'll be returning back to Providence in July.
Awesome. Thank you so much for interrupting your sabbatical to talk to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
S-
Actually, one of my sabbatical goals was to learn how to communicate the science that I do in ways that
Ah,
sort of everybody could understand.
good opportunity to practice. I found you through an article. I do think you explain it very clearly, certainly in writing. So let's see how you do verbally, shall we? So your work combines neuroscience with genetics. So can you begin by explaining what addiction is and how it affects our brain?
So, as you mentioned, my work is largely focused on the very basic neuroscientific and genetic principles underlying reward in the brain. And so, in my lab, we also study how alcohol and drugs abuse influence these natural reward mechanisms. And I think the general consensus among scientists and healthcare professionals is that there's a strong neurobiological and genetic basis for addiction. People are innately wired to seek and respond to rewards. Your brain interprets food as rewarding when you're hungry and water as rewarding when you're thirsty. But addictive substances like alcohol and drugs of abuse, they can overwhelm these natural reward pathways in your brain. And this results in intolerable cravings and reduced impulse control. So, what we know about addiction is that it's a disorder where your brain circuits start working differently. And this acts to reduce your impulse control and it results in reward seeking, which you prioritize in your life, even if there are a lot of negative consequences.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like a hijack, isn't it?
Yeah, I try
As
to avoid the word hijack specifically because I feel like that suggests that it's something that happens really fast. But it
Mhm.
isn't. It's something that happens really slowly with repeated use. And I
Yeah.
think that's something we don't appreciate enough about how addiction forms.
Yeah, I was interviewing someone the other day and he said it takes the normal social drinker that is drinking, say, a couple of glasses of wine a night. And if they are likely to become dependent, because not everybody does, but he said it takes about 20 years. When I think about my own example, I was a social drinker in my teens, 20s, 30s, 40s even. But by my 50s, I was using it more to self medicate. And in my 50s, I tried to quit and I couldn't. And that's when I realized how dependent I'd become. So it takes a while. I absolutely agree.
And there's some variation in this. Some people will drink their whole life and they won't
Yeah,
create a
absolutely. I know
dependence. And
some of
then,
them.
yeah, and others form a dependence at early adolescence. We actually truly have very little understanding about this variation in addiction.
Yeah, I have met young people that have gone at it really hard, the drinking or the drugs or whatever, and they have got
Mhm.
addicted quite young. We say at Tribe Sober that overcoming alcohol dependency is not about willpower, that it's more about mindset. Would you agree with that?
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned mindset. My opinion is that our perspective or the way that we view things affects how we view ourselves and how we view the world around us. So, overcoming alcohol dependence, it requires a change in the way that you're viewing your life and how you do things on a day to day basis. And change can be really difficult. I think humans naturally don't like change very much. But if we view change as a positive long term goal, and then step by step, it becomes easier. I agree with you that a mindset is really important. And it's important to keep in mind that a growth mindset or
Yeah.
an understanding that you want to change, but there can be setbacks. And the important thing is to learn from these setbacks is the right way to approach any kind of change in our life, whether it's weight loss or overcoming alcohol or drug dependence.
Yeah, absolutely. We suggest people reframe their problem as they see it into more of an opportunity because for a
Exactly.
lot of us, our lives have changed so positively since we've stopped drinking or drugging or whatever. I think if we can see it as an opportunity rather than some terrible problem, but I do understand why people are depressed at the thought of it because I was the same. I couldn't imagine my life without alcohol. I just thought it would be a very dull and dreary place. And indeed, it is a bit like that in very early sobriety. So you really hang in there until things change. Talk to us about how alcohol abuse can affect our DNA.
I love this question. Alcohol abuse doesn't necessarily change our DNA directly. So I'm going to step back and explain a little bit what I mean by this. Every one of your brain cells, whether it's a neuron or a glia, has your genetic code stored in long strands of DNA. And so, for all of that DNA to fit inside every single cell, it needs to be packed super tightly. This is achieved by winding the DNA around spools of proteins. These are called histones. And areas where the DNA is tightly wound, the genes stay dormant. But in areas where the DNA is unwound, the genes can get turned on or off. So these genes encode proteins, and proteins are the things inside cells that are doing all of the important functions of the cell. So when gene activity changes, the proteins in your cell also change. And so these changes can range from a single neuronal connection in your brain to have massive changes in how you behave. So there's this beautiful choreography basically going on in every single cell inside of your brain that suggests that while your genes affect how your brain develops, which genes get turned on or off when you're learning new things or behaving in certain ways, this is very dynamic and it adapts to suit your daily needs. So, a lot of the recent data that comes out of research suggests that alcohol and drugs of abuse directly influence the changes in your gene expression. So, not the DNA directly, but how your genes are turned on or off. And the changes are happening in areas of your brain that drive memories responses and reward responses. So, addiction in a lot of ways is almost a disorder of memory because it's memory for the feeling of being intoxicated. Maybe it's the dim lighting of a bar or a particular friend that you drink with, or even the feel of a glass in your hand that can trigger the feeling that alcohol gives you. So these are all sensory memories that are formed inside of your brain and can trigger feelings of craving when you're trying to recover. And so changing gene expression in these brain regions has profound impacts on our behavior.
Wow, fascinating. So there's been a lot of progress, hasn't there, in understanding addiction during the last decade? Can you give us a brief overview of the kind of progress that the scientists are making?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the interesting things about the last decade is there's been an explosion in our knowledge of molecular genetics. And this has told us a lot about how brains work and how circuits inside of our brains work. So, the changes in our understanding in the molecular mechanisms of addiction are largely due to a better understanding of how genes are dynamically regulated in the brain, how they're turned on, how they're turned off, and how they affect how your neurons talk to each other. So there's many ways that addictive substances can change gene expression. They can alter which proteins bind to DNA, and this affects which genes get turned on and off. It also affects how tightly wound the DNA is. And so that'll affect whether a gene is dormant or whether it's active. They can also change the process of how DNA is read and translated into proteins. So, alcohol, for example, can cause an alternative form of a gene to be expressed. One gene can have many different forms of protein, and those proteins can have small differences in function that can actually affect in a massive way how brain circuits function. We know that this alternative form of a gene, for example, is expressed in memory circuits, both in flies and in people. So, it's a highly conserved mechanism. And this changes dopamine receptors And it also changes important proteins that are affecting massive swaths of gene expression inside of reward circuits, which then impacts how the neurons are functioning. Alcohol can do this, and similarly, cocaine can cause alternative forms of genes to be expressed in reward centers. And this results in the uh, animals seeking more cocaine. So, exactly how these drugs cause changes in gene expression is still unknown, but there are some direct links that we understand now. Um, One of the most beautiful studies that I've seen recently was showing a direct link between alcohol consumption and changes in gene expression in mice. So, what happens is the mice were drinking alcohol, and then it gets broken down into all its component metabolite parts in the liver. And then one of these sort of molecules can leave the liver, can cross the brain into the brain, and then it can get into the mice's reward circuits and unwind DNA from histones in the memory circuits. That then impacts the function of those circuits. So, alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, opiates, they all activate really important signaling pathways that are central regulators of metabolism in our brain. This is important because it suggests that they can affect many aspects of neuronal function and consequently affect which genes are turned on or off.
Wow. Do you have any idea what happens when somebody has an alcoholic blackout?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. We know that alcohol can affect many areas of the brain. And when you drink high concentrations of alcohol, your body wants to shut down to save you
Yeah.
from drinking so much that it would irreversibly affect you. We don't know exactly all of the mechanisms that happen, but we do know that alcohol affects memory circuits. Very few people actually studied this aspect of how alcohol affects the brain, but I suspect it's more like a turned up version of how alcohol can more subtly affect reward circuits inside of the brain. We do know that it might be associated with neuron loss, but I suspect that it's more profound than that and affects how neurons are talking to each other, as well as which neurons are present and which neurons are absent.
Yeah, somebody did tell me once that our brain gets so soaked in alcohol that it can't even make memories. It's not that it's forgotten stuff, but it can't make those short-term memories and then transfer it to the long-term memory. So I remember thinking that was quite sinister,
Yeah,
that you just can't
absolutely.
make memories.
Yeah. Or it can, in lower concentrations, make memories even stronger, like memories for the sensory experience. So that cue, the feeling of the glass in your
Mm,
hand, is stronger than it would be if there was just juice in that glass, for example, because it's amplifying
yeah.
those connections inside of the brain. So pour more alcohol on that, and the connections are no longer amplified, but they're firing too much or even getting destroyed in some cases.
I wanted to ask you about when we stop drinking, because in my case, I drank far too much for a few decades and then I stopped. And I was okay for a while, I think, because I was so pleased with myself that I'd finally done this. So I felt quite good for a month or two. And then I started feeling really depressed and I had what I call anhedonia. I just couldn't find pleasure in anything. I've always wondered if that's because I relied on alcohol for so many years to make me feel good. When that was taken away, were my natural dopamine receptors just not working anymore? Had they gone to sleep thinking, oh, she's got her wine, she doesn't need us?
I think that's probably part of the equation because when you use alcohol for many years in a row, it causes a lot of changes to happen to your brain, and your brain can't bounce back like an elastic band. When you spend many years changing it, it's going to take many years to change it in more positive ways. I don't think any scientists know if it can change back to exactly the form it was before. But brains are so plastic, they can adapt in many different ways. So even if you're not changing the way that it was before, it's changing in a way that can help you move in a positive direction. Now, whether it's just dopamine receptors, we don't know. We do know that they play a role. But it's not just your dopamine receptors that are changing. There's so many different neurotransmitter and peptide systems in the brain that are getting affected. Some of them are noradrenaline, that part that's supposed to give you energy, and serotonin, which is thought to be associated with contentment and reward and social behaviors. Neuropeptides that are important in social behavior, like oxytocin, and your brain's natural reward peptides, like endogenous opiates. So I like to think of the brain as this massive concert that's happening where the drums and the violins and the brass section are all working together in concert to make this beautiful output response where the music is your behavior. And so maybe if you change the drums a little, the signal is a little bit different. The music that's coming out is a little bit different. But it isn't until you change many of these different components that the music stops or the music sounds completely discoherent. So the brain is a bit like that. So when you use alcohol or any drug for many years in a row, what you're doing is you're changing the entire symphony. You're not necessarily just changing the drums. The stuff that I study in my lab, it's not looking at the proteins that are just necessarily this receptor or that neurotransmitter. We're looking at those proteins that turn on massive arrays of gene expression. And I think that's really important in the context of memory and addiction because what's happening is massive changes to result in a whole new homeostasis of the brain. At this point, we're just at the tip of the iceberg in understanding exactly how all of this. I think that gives us a lot of hope, though, right? Because the more we understand about how this happens, the more that we be able to reverse it or at least move it in a more positive direction to help you be able to create a similar music to the kind that was originally started.
Yeah, I love the analogy of the brain like an orchestra. That's beautiful. So, yeah, I found that period, that anhedonia, it did pass, but it took 2 or 3 months. I was so tempted to go back to drinking during that time because I thought, oh, I can't live the rest of my life feeling flat and miserable like this, but it passed. My theory is that it passed when I found a really interesting project to throw myself into, which was, in fact, creating Tribe Sober, because suddenly I was busy. I had so much to do, and I got really engaged and interested and had to learn new things and connect with new people. And then it passed. So we say to our members sometimes, they say, "Oh, I've been sober for a few months and I still feel rubbish, feel a bit miserable. What am I going to do?" We say, "Get a project, just learn something new, go on a trip, do something different." And it very often works.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant advice. I think it's important to combine a bunch of different aspects about your life and any kind of recovery. There's drugs out there that can help, but it needs to be combined with other aspects of your life. Maybe
Yeah.
it's a new project. Maybe
Mm.
it's a really strong support circle. Maybe it's behavior therapy where you're talking through things with people. So I think creating a more dynamic and rounded life can help you feel comfort in times when things are just really difficult.
Yeah, yeah. You have to make big changes. You have to reconfigure your life really because you can't just stop drinking and keep everything else the same because for a start you'll really miss it because there'll be a big hole where the drinking was. Secondly, you just need to find new interests, new people, new things, and that's where eventually the stimulation will come from.
Yeah, and your lifestyle can affect things through the way that it's affecting genes in your brain, actually. So, diet is a very interesting example of this. And we don't necessarily know if it works this way in humans, but in animals. The diet can significantly affect which genes are turned on and off in reward pathways. Sleep is another thing that I think is completely underestimated. We really don't know what's going on in the brain when we sleep, but we do know how important it is.
Yeah.
And we know now that it affects gene expression in lots of really interesting ways. Exercise has also been shown to dynamically affect gene expression. There's a lot of different ways that I think that people can speed up the process of healing by creating a more plastic or more dynamic brain.
Yeah. One of the many joys of alcohol-free lifestyle is sleep. But we go from getting something like 2 cycles of REM sleep if we drink, and more like the 7 that we should get. Some of us, when we're having this poor quality sleep that one gets when we drink, we just feel tired all the time because that fatigue builds up and builds up. So that when we do ditch the stuff and after being alcohol free for a while, you're just full of energy. I guess it's just how we should be normally, but we were suppressing all that energy for a long time.
It's hard to see that happen because it happens so slowly over time.
Yeah.
You want to drink because it makes you a little bit sleepy before you go to bed. But unfortunately, what it also does is it significantly affects the deep sleep that you get. So even though you think it's helping you get sleepy, it's actually making the situation so much worse.
So let's talk about your animals, shall we? Talk to us about why some animals get addicted to alcohol. I loved your little video of the drunk monkeys at the holiday resort on your website. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So a lot of what we understand about how the brain works is through animal models that we study. I think what people think about addiction mostly in the context of humans, it's characterized as a compulsive and physiological need for a habit forming substance. So nearly all animals, from flies to humans, find alcohol rewarding. I think similar things are going to also be found with other drugs of abuse. All of these animals, they demonstrate tolerance, which means that you need higher concentrations to get the same effects. And they get physiological symptoms upon withdrawing the substances. So I think what's truly remarkable about this is they all react somewhat similarly to psychoactive substances. I think that tells us really important features of how brains work and how toxins that are made in nature, because all of these substances, like cocaine, was made by plants to kill insects. So all of them affect the nervous system in interesting ways across all animal species. So we can learn a lot from animals because of that. The monkeys, I think, are a very interesting example because they demonstrate dependence that looks a lot more like human dependence, right? So they'll steal drinks out of people's hands, and some male monkeys get really aggressive, the way that you sometimes see in humans as well. I think what this generally tells us is that alcohol can act very similarly on lots of different types of brains. And there's some cultural components of behavior that are demonstrated depending on the types of species that are feeling these types of substances. So in my lab, we study fruit flies. A lot of people, when I tell them, oh, I study flies to understand addiction, they laugh a little because basically what my job is to get flies drunk. But there's real reasons why we do this, right? So the reason I use fruit flies or Drosophila melanogaster is that they've been studied as a genetic model organism in labs for over 100 years. Since the very start of fruit fly research, people have been using flies to understand the genetic basis of behavior. What that means is that there are so many tools available in the world to basically manipulate genes and manipulate individual neurons inside of the brain. So at this point, we have the technology to turn up or down almost any gene we want in almost any brain cell we want. So that gives a profound level of control over how a brain works. That allows us to really dive very deeply into understanding how alcohol and how other types of drugs affect how our memory circuits work or how any type of neuron works. Because in truth, we have very little understanding of all of the different things that can happen inside of a brain. But we work together with scientists that study many different types of animal models and humans. And the idea is that in flies, we can do a really exploratory, basic neuroscience type work, sort of cutting edge. Let's try this. Let's try that. What if this works? What if that works? And I find that very exciting because it's very discovery based. And then if we find something really fascinating, we work with other scientists. And then those scientists can look to see if it's also happening in rodent brains or if it's likely happening this way in human brains as well. And I think one of the most interesting and important things about science is it's rarely done in isolation. I think really important translational science happens by people collaborating, sharing ideas freely all over the world. So that's one of my favorite aspects of the job is the ability
Absolutely.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, take our cutting edge stuff and talk to people
Mm.
that are working with people who are in recovery in hopes of coming up with whole new ways of treatment that nobody even thought about before.
Have you seen any applications in the treatment area of this new understanding of addiction?
The stuff that we do is the stuff that takes 50, 70 years to
Right.
translate. And so I don't expect to see any immediate changes of what we do. But I think that overall, there's a general shift in our understanding of how brains work and how genes are regulated inside of brains. So people are starting to rethink their narrative about addiction. Most scientists now would say dopamine isn't necessarily the reward molecule because it does a lot of different things inside of the brain, right? It acts as a teaching signal and it acts in impulse control and all of these other types of things as well. So the type of research we're doing is basically saying, maybe look at these different types of proteins over here and look at how these different types of transmitters act together in order to create a more profound signal that can result in changes in behavior.
Yeah. Was your PhD in addiction?
I didn't start studying addiction until I was doing my postdoctoral training, which is the training one typically does after their PhD in order to form an independent research program. The reason why I moved into that is not necessarily I wasn't directly thinking, oh, I'm going to find really important methods to treat addiction. My thought was really, we don't understand enough about how the brain works to really understand how addiction works. So if I study this in flies, I can hit the brain with a hammer, like alcohol would act as the hammer in that
Mm.
case, or cocaine or methamphetamine. And then we can study all of the really discrete, small changes that happen together and then create a story about all of these changes that are happening that can then be moved into more complex brain. So my thought process was like, we need to take 10 steps back and really understand how things are happening at smaller and smaller levels to create a larger incumbent story of how
Yeah.
circuits work and how behavior works.
Yeah. It's a very exciting field, isn't it? I still remember we believed, the lay people believed that your brain was more or less fixed. And as you got older, you lost brain cells and you couldn't really learn anything new as you got older. And the thinking is so different now, isn't it? And the neuroplasticity, and it's full of hope, really, compared with how people used to believe, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly how I like to think about it. Our brain is really plastic in terms of how things are connected and how they're talking to each other. And the part that's plastic, actually, you even dive deeper down inside of the molecular level, and all of those molecules are plastic. And all those things are affecting how cells are talking to each other. And our behaviors, our choices, the drugs that we take to recover, as well as the drugs that we take to that can hurt us, can affect that on many different levels. I think it's important to start thinking about it this way because I think for a long time people felt that addiction is heritable. It's in our genes. We get it from our family. Sometimes it makes us feel a little sad because it doesn't feel like we have a lot of ability to change that. But this new understanding, I think, brings a new way of thinking about this because even if you're born with this particular set of genes, you have control or the autonomy to
Absolutely.
change
Yeah. It's only
how
a
they're turned on.
predisposition, isn't it, really? It seems to go one of two ways. People either think, I never want to be like that, so I will never drink. Or people think, as you said, oh, I'm doomed. I might as well have a drink. But we say to
Exactly.
people, think of genetics as a gun, but your finger's on the trigger, really. You still have a choice. I think also there's that added incentive that you can change the heritage, if you like, that line, because your children, if you're alcohol free, then they're less likely to have a problem as they grow up. Yeah, it's an interesting field. So you mentioned meditation, I think, in your article, saying that you believe that it can help people in recovery, as we do as well. Can you talk to us about how meditation can reduce inflammation?
I can try. So I want to preface this by everything everything that we understand about meditation has to come from humans because we don't really have a good way of testing
You mean
meditation.
your flies don't meditate?
If they do, I haven't been able to observe it. And it's a bit tricky sometimes interpreting human research. There are some really interesting studies out there that show that even short, intense bouts of meditation can affect your neuroinflammation. But we don't know for sure if this is due to meditation or other things that come with meditation because, you're likely to change your sleep and your diet and maybe even exercise habits when you're in
Oh,
these
yeah.
intensive bouts of meditation. So it could be a combination of many different factors. But what I think most people agree with is that meditation can be really helpful in shifting your mind frame. I know some people actually find it really difficult to meditate. And so my general philosophy about this is that there's many different ways that you can help your body become healthier. Meditation can be one of them. And if it works for you, that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. So if alcohol rewires our brain, if that's the right way to put it, is it possible to repair the damage when we say alcohol free?
So this is a very interesting question. Can we repair the damage? But I'm wondering if that's not the right way to think about it. Maybe what we need to think about it not as damage necessarily, but a change that's happened in our brain that can then be adapted in an interesting way. Because the truth is, we don't know if we can repair exactly the changes that happened to make them like they were before alcohol. But I don't think that matters.
Let's make a new symphony.
Yes, exactly. Let's throw in some new instruments and make a new sound, a new song that brings reward and brings pleasure and a positive perspective on life. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that because as I mentioned, the brain is really plastic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So your lifestyle and even medications that you take for treatment and the social circle that you have around you, all of this can help you grow your brain in really interesting plastic ways. So you don't have to go back. You can just move forward.
Yeah.
And everything that you do can help that process happen.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way to look at it, Carla. So what about you? Do you drink?
So I'm one of these rare people that doesn't actually like alcohol very much.
Wow.
I don't really know why that is, but I suspect it's some combination of my biology, but also the way that I grew up. So I grew up in a society that was profoundly affected by alcohol use. So I've seen the damage that it can do not only to families, but to basically an entire culture. When you see that at an early age, it can have profound impacts on how you view alcohol use and life in general. But I actually don't like the feeling that it gives to my brain. I like feeling fuzzy. So I generally avoid alcohol.
Yeah. You like to stay sharp, huh?
I do. I do.
So you've got a lovely website called Calm Lab. Am I saying it right? Your second
Yeah, yeah.
name? I'm going to put it in the show notes. Is that the best place for people to learn more about you and look at your work? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Can I ask you if you have any practical advice for anybody struggling with their addiction or alcohol dependence, bearing in mind your scientific knowledge? What would you say to someone that knows that they're drinking too much, but they just don't know how to stop or how to cut down and they just feel overwhelmed?
Yeah. I know it can be really hard. I think, as I mentioned previously, I think it's because change can feel really hard. And I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a therapist. So all of my opinions are basically based on some of the basic scientific knowledge. But what I hope is that what we understand about how the brain works now is providing some sort of hope because there are effective treatments out there. And you can
Yeah.
combine these medications with behavior therapy and lifestyle changes. And combining all of these sort of positive ways to move forward can definitively affect how your brain works. They affect how your brain interprets reward. And this can lead to a lifestyle that you're happier with. It's important to create a strong social network. It's important to understand you aren't alone. And it's important to understand that these things take time. It's not something that can
Yeah.
happen overnight. And part of the reason is because the plasticity in your brain can't change overnight. There's so many little tiny molecular soldiers out there that are working together to help your brain function. And you can't change an entire symphony overnight. You have to change it one instrument at a time before the song can sound really coherent again.
There is hope, isn't there? We actually do a challenge. We put people on an alcohol-free challenge for 66 days on the basis that after 66 days, they will have built a neural pathway. Is that correct?
I think for everybody, there's going to be a different timeline
Yeah.
that works for them. And it depends a lot on their experience and how long they're using and how elastic their brain actually is. But I think that sounds about right. You need at least 2 months to
Yeah.
create any kind of lasting changes.
Yeah, exactly. And we talk to
Mhm.
people as they get towards their 66 days. And normally they say things like, I feel so much better. I think I'm going to go to 100 days. When you get to 66 days, you just feel different. You really do. And you can cope with the thought of doing 100 days and then 6 months. So I think you have to do it step by step. Awesome. Anything else you think we should mention, Carla?
There isn't anything I could think to mention other than I think it's important to know that there are scientists from all over the world working in their labs and also working together to help increase our knowledge of how the brain works and increase our knowledge of how addictive substances can affect the brain. So there's a lot of people out there that are rooting for you and
Oh,
they really want to help society in general and help people to understand what's happening to them and understand positive ways of moving forward.